He was the second king of the Tudor dynasty, and also the second son, so he was not initially the heir to the throne. As the younger son of the monarch, he was most likely expected to pursue a religious career, but fate had other plans for him. King Henry VIII was without a doubt the most legendary and famous of all English monarchs. Never before, and never after, was there a king as bold, ruthless, cruel, beloved, and hated as he was. During his long and controversial reign, he dismantled the administrative and religious structures of the medieval world and created his own modern state. Yet all of that seems to pale in comparison when we talk about his countless, dramatic, and unstable romantic affairs. He had 6 wives and several mistresses, something quite unusual for the time. His marital problems went far beyond the bedroom and led to the downfall of several of his queens and at least 2 of his most important ministers. Today, you will travel with me to his court to learn more about the life of the legendary Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Henry VIII was the youngest son of Henry VII, the king who, together with his wife Elizabeth of York, founded the Tudor dynasty. In 1485, after defeating Richard III in the bloody Battle of Bosworth, his father, Henry VII, claimed the English crown. Henry VIII was born at Greenwich Palace in 1491. There are not many reliable sources about his childhood or his relationship with his father. It was likely a distant one, as the elder son, Arthur, was the true heir and received most of the attention. Arthur was the important one. He was the firstborn and the future king. Henry spent his early years in London, where he received an excellent education alongside his siblings. They had tutors who taught them Latin, French, Italian, mathematics, history, and poetry. In addition, Henry studied theology and the scriptures. He also received music lessons and took part in physical training, and he excelled in nearly every discipline, unlike his brother Arthur, who was a frail, reserved young man. Arthur disliked sports and festivities, avoided crowds, and was frequently ill. Henry VII was the one who began the Tudor era. He was a modern king who managed to establish peace and stability in the kingdom, gaining the support of the emerging middle class. His wife was Elizabeth of York, niece of King Richard III and daughter of Edward IV. By marrying Elizabeth, Henry VII secured his claim to the throne and ensured that the bloodline of his children would be more noble and royal than his own. As the first Tudor monarch, he was fully committed to establishing a lasting dynasty, and he quickly began forming alliances with powerful European states. His plan was to marry off his children to heirs of politically significant royal families. But this was no easy task. For example, it took him 13 years to arrange the marriage of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain. Ironically, it was little Prince Henry, not her betrothed Arthur, who welcomed Catherine when she first arrived in England. Her ship had been delayed. Years later, she would recall feeling that this was a bad omen and that she should have paid attention to the signs. After the wedding, Catherine and Arthur were sent to Wales to begin learning the duties of future monarchs. But both of them fell ill with the virus, and the situation turned tragic. Arthur died, while Catherine survived and returned to court as the widowed Princess of Wales. Henry, who until then had been kept away from public life, was summoned by his father. He later wrote, "I entered the king's chambers as the second son, but I left as the heir and future king." Following the tragic death of his older brother Arthur in 1502, Henry was named Prince of Wales at the age of 10. Henry VII, devastated by the loss of his heir, was reluctant to send Catherine back to Spain, as he wanted to preserve the alliance with the Catholic monarchs. He also had no intention of returning the first part of the generous dowry. Being a practical man, he came up with the idea of marrying Catherine to Henry, the new Prince of Wales. But there was a problem. The church strictly forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. So he questioned Catherine, asking whether the marriage had been consummated. She swore it had not. Taking her word, Henry VII requested an annulment and asked the Pope for a special dispensation to allow her to marry Henry. Eventually, the Pope granted the dispensation, and everyone was relieved, especially Catherine's parents. However, they made it clear that they would only pay the rest of the dowry once the marriage had taken place. But Henry VII would never see that money, for in 1509, before his son could marry Princess Catherine of Aragon, he fell ill and died. Henry, now 18, immediately ascended the throne of England. Henry VII had ruled for 24 years. He was a cautious, even miserly king, who for many years imposed heavy taxes on the population. The accession of the new king was met with great joy and optimism. The entire country seemed uplifted by the arrival of a young, handsome, and athletic monarch. The people's excitement grew even more with the announcement of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Spanish princess was already beloved by the English public. She was a beautiful, cheerful young woman and had grown accustomed to the ways of the English court. Soon after becoming king, Henry moved quickly, and the two were married without delay. But it didn't seem like a marriage of convenience. The couple genuinely appeared to love and care for one another. So much so that Henry delayed his own coronation just so he could be crowned alongside his beloved wife. He was 18 and she was 24, but the age difference was barely noticeable. They were a striking pair. Henry used to say that even if he had been free to choose any woman in the world, he would still have chosen her. Henry was a remarkably athletic young man who loved to show off, spend lavishly, and build grand things. He was talented, passionate about music, played several instruments, and even wrote ardent poetry for his wife. He also dreamed of turning his new court into the greatest cultural center in Europe, actively promoting education and the arts. And that wasn't all. He invited renowned musicians, artists, and poets to join his court, which was designed to dazzle both its residents and foreign visitors alike. This initiative sparked great excitement throughout the kingdom. Yet even in the early years of his reign, Henry VIII showed signs that he would become a ruthless, all-powerful autocrat. He once said, "I am content with what I have. I only wish to govern my subjects, but I shall not allow anyone to govern me. I will not even tolerate the possibility." He was highly gifted and loved to display his talents. On top of that, he had inherited a fortune from his father. Henry ascended the throne with full coffers and a team of excellent advisors. He was young, a king, and fabulously wealthy, but he showed little gratitude toward those who had served his father for years, managing the finances of the realm. He quickly turned against two of his father's most trusted counselors, accusing them of treason and ordering their public execution by beheading. These were only the first of countless executions for treason that Henry would command throughout his life. As time passed, his brutality only escalated. Even in the early years of his reign, he executed numerous dukes, nobles, barons, knights, squires, and earls, eliminating anyone with royal blood or even a distant claim to the throne, real or imagined. Merciless and unscrupulous, he always found a way to accuse them of treason to justify their deaths. However, in 1509, the people were so enchanted by the splendor of the court that they barely noticed what was happening behind the scenes. And the king's happiness was seemingly complete when, on New Year's Day in 1511, Queen Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy, whom they named Henry. Overjoyed, the king organized a grand celebration that included a 2-day tournament at Westminster. But the monarch's joy was tragically short-lived. Just 10 days later, the infant prince fell ill and died. The loss hit Henry hard. Both he and Catherine were left utterly devastated. In November 1511, Pope Julius II proposed forming a Holy League alongside Spain. This new alliance would declare war on France, and any spoils of war would be divided equally among the allies. Eager to refill the royal treasury, Henry agreed. At the time, the task of organizing the effort fell to an ambitious clergyman named Thomas Wolsey. He handled it with such skill and dedication that upon Henry's return from war, he was immediately promoted. This man, the son of a humble butcher, soon found himself on the king's privy council. In October 1515, impressed by Wolsey's intellect, The king wrote to the Pope requesting that he be made a cardinal. In truth, the two formed a formidable partnership, and together they governed England for 15 years with relentless efficiency. Henry VIII and Wolsey were both ambitious and shared many personality traits. It's no surprise that Wolsey stirred envy at court due to his closeness to the king. He was exceptionally talented, incredibly intelligent, and an indefatigable worker. Henry had no doubt about his loyalty. During this period, however, a series of personal tragedies took a toll on the king and queen. The death of their first son, the birth of a stillborn child in 1513, and a premature delivery the following year plunged the couple into sorrow. Their relationship began to deteriorate. Catherine became deeply religious, spending long hours in prayer. At times, she even practiced self-flagellation, believing that divine mercy might yet grant her the male heir she so desperately wanted. Meanwhile, Henry began to seek solace elsewhere, and during this phase, he started engaging in relationships with other women. Still, their fortunes seemed to shift in February 1516, when the Queen gave birth to a healthy daughter, Mary. The royal couple rejoiced at her arrival, but the pressure to produce a male heir remained intense. Henry began to doubt Catherine's ability to give him a son. He no longer looked at her the same way. Time, multiple pregnancies, and stress had changed Catherine's appearance. To Henry, she no longer seemed as attractive and appeared older than her years. By 1518, Henry was in the midst of a passionate affair with a lady of the court named Elizabeth Blount, who also served as one of Catherine's attendants. Ironically, Elizabeth succeeded where the Queen had not. She gave birth to a healthy boy, whom they named Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy was the surname traditionally given to royal illegitimate children. In 1520, Henry celebrated peace with France in a spectacular event known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Francis I and Henry VIII met in northern France for a majestic display of diplomacy and festivity meant to solidify their newfound friendship. Golden pavilions were erected, and for 17 days there were feasts, tournaments, and celebrations. All of London seemed to be in attendance, leaving the capital nearly empty. The festivities concluded with the betrothal of Princess Mary to the young French Dauphin, sealing peace between the two kingdoms. However, on the European continent, waves of religious unrest were beginning to stir. A German monk named Martin Luther emerged as the leading voice of a new movement, Protestantism, openly criticizing the Catholic Church's practice of selling indulgences, documents that supposedly guaranteed the partial or total salvation of the soul, depending on the price paid. Martin Luther protested against this practice, which he believed drove the faithful away from the true sacrament of confession and genuine repentance. And this was just one of many practices Luther deemed unworthy of the house of God. He urged the Church to return to the original principles of the Bible, thus igniting the Protestant Reformation. Henry VIII, up to that point a devout Catholic, was deeply offended by these new ideas that were beginning to spread across Europe. He became a staunch defender of the old faith, and in 1521, he wrote a famous treatise in Latin entitled Defense of the Seven Sacraments. In it, the king passionately defended the Pope and exalted the Catholic faith. The text also included some phrases that would later be heavily criticized, especially those based on biblical verses that proclaimed, "What God has joined together, let no man separate." The Pope received the treatise with great enthusiasm and, flattered by the verses dedicated by the king, granted Henry the title Defender of the Faith. Meanwhile, the royal couple was going through a critical time. Queen Catherine had given birth to another daughter, who was stillborn, shocking the entire country, which was growing increasingly concerned about the issue of succession. Henry was desperate. A man as proud and virile as he was, felt utterly incapable of providing his subjects with a male heir, and naturally, his frustration with Catherine continued to grow. The love and devotion he once felt for her began to turn into disdain for failing to meet his expectations. It is believed that he had already made up his mind to divorce Catherine when, in 1527, he met Anne Boleyn and fell madly in love. Anne was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, and had grown up at the French court, where she received an excellent education. She was elegant, charming, and exceptionally shrewd. At first, the king was drawn to her older sister, Mary, with whom he had a brief affair. Then he proposed the same arrangement to Anne, hoping to make her his mistress as well. But the young woman, ambitious and clever, refused his advances. Anne had no intention of becoming anyone's mistress. She aspired to the crown. So she resisted the king's charm, unless he promised to marry her and make her queen. For over 6 years, Anne Boleyn kept him captivated with her wit and the promise of a son. Henry became completely obsessed with her. By then, he felt nothing for Catherine and could think only of Anne. His love for her grew stronger, precisely because she refused to surrender to him without a formal commitment. Henry brought the matter to Cardinal Wolsey, asking him to resolve what would later become known as the Great Matter. By then, Wolsey had begun to fall from the king's favor. He had grown greedy and amassed vast wealth and property, which angered Henry. The annulment request was his opportunity to regain the king's affection and trust. But what Henry asked for was nearly impossible: to annul his 24-year marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The justification? That Catherine had previously been married to Henry's brother, making their marriage invalid and incestuous. Henry claimed God was punishing him for living in sin with his brother's widow by denying him a male heir. But the request was unprecedented and completely contrary to Catholic doctrine. Only the Pope could grant such permission. To make matters worse, the political landscape in Europe was shifting. Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, invaded Rome and took the Pope hostage. Under those circumstances, it was even less likely that the Pope would offend Charles by annulling his aunt's marriage. Still, Henry refused to accept excuses. He was determined to rid himself of Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn, in hopes of finally having the heir he so desperately desired. A special commission was formed to examine the matter of the divorce. The appointed judges were Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio, who arrived from Rome to study the case and offer a solution. Wolsey was eager to please Henry and obtain the annulment, but Campeggio, following the Pope's orders, deliberately stalled the process. The Pope had instructed him to delay the decision as long as possible, hoping the king would tire of Anne and reconcile with Catherine. As expected, Henry lost his patience and directed all his anger and resentment at Wolsey. For failing to secure the annulment, Wolsey was stripped of his position as Lord Chancellor. Desperate, he appealed to both Francis I of France and Charles V to intercede on his behalf with the king. This enraged Henry even more, as he saw Wolsey's actions as a betrayal. He ordered his arrest and had him sent to London for punishment. But Wolsey never made it. He died en route, narrowly escaping a humiliating public execution. His downfall was as swift as his rise to power. After Wolsey's death, Henry appointed Thomas More as Lord Chancellor. More was a philosopher, lawyer, and diplomat whom the king deeply admired. He was also a devout Catholic, loyal to the Holy Scriptures, the Roman Church, and the Pope. In fact, he felt honored to be appointed Lord Chancellor, as he also respected and admired the king. But he was honest with Henry and told him he could not, in good conscience, involve himself in the matter of the divorce. At that point, Henry promised he wouldn't drag More into the issue and would leave it to other lords. More accepted and was appointed Lord Chancellor in 1529. By July 1531, Henry ordered Queen Catherine to move into Wolsey's former residence. They would never see each other again. Henry also forbade her from writing to him or seeing their daughter, Princess Mary. This was a devastating blow to Catherine, who still loved him deeply and was extremely close to her only child. She felt utterly rejected and unjustly treated, yet she remained strong-willed, insisting, "I am the king's wife, and so I shall remain while I live." Time passed, and Henry grew more impatient and frustrated. Still, he was determined to obtain his divorce. A cleric named Thomas Cranmer, soon to be appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, advised the king to consult European universities about the possibility of annulling his marriage to Catherine. Desperate to marry Anne Boleyn and rid himself of his wife, Henry agreed, and a commission was formed. The divorce case had already dragged on for 6 years, and Henry's patience with the Church and the Pope was wearing thin. Moreover, a portion of the population had grown tired of what they saw as abuses and injustices committed by the Church, and Henry noticed a strong sense of unrest toward Rome. He saw in this dissatisfaction an opportunity to take advantage and push forward his personal cause. Ironically, the same man who had once authored a treatise defending Catholic doctrine now sought to undermine it, all in order to divorce his wife and marry another woman in the hopes of securing a long-awaited male heir. Anne Boleyn, too, was growing impatient. In 1532, she relented. She slept with the king and soon became pregnant, an event that hastened everything. The child had to be born within wedlock. The two married in secret, and on January 25, 1533, they were wed again in a public ceremony. That May, a special court was summoned to examine the divorce, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, and his union with Anne Boleyn legitimate. From then on, only the children born of Henry and Anne would be considered rightful heirs. Thus, Mary, daughter of Henry and Catherine, was declared illegitimate, stripped of her royal title, and henceforth called Lady Mary. Catherine received the humiliating news via letter. She was no longer queen, but merely the Dowager Princess of Wales. Soon after, Parliament passed an arbitrary law forbidding any appeal to Rome, thereby preventing Catherine from seeking help from the Catholic Church. With that, the Pope's authority in England was entirely eliminated, and in response, the Pope excommunicated Henry VIII. In June, Anne Boleyn was crowned queen, and on September 7th, she gave birth to a child. To Henry's great disappointment, it was not a prince, but a daughter, Elizabeth. Many say that the moment Elizabeth was born, Henry ceased to love Anne Boleyn. Nonetheless, he was determined to sever all ties with Rome. He demanded that his most important subjects support his decision by taking an oath of supremacy. From that point forward, he would be the supreme head of the Church in England. Sir Thomas More had already resigned as Lord Chancellor upon learning of the king's intentions to separate from Rome, and he refused to take the oath. Furious, Henry made one of the most cruel and impulsive decisions of his reign. He sentenced one of the most brilliant and respected men of the time to a brutal death. Thomas More was convicted of treason, even though he had maintained from the start that he would not act against his conscience. He spent a year imprisoned in the Tower of London before being beheaded. It was one of the few executions Henry would come to regret for the rest of his life. Anne Boleyn, who was already deeply unpopular in England, being widely blamed for the misfortunes of Catherine of Aragon, was now also held responsible for the death of Thomas More. Her position grew increasingly precarious, especially because she had failed to fulfill her promise of delivering a male heir, and she knew it. In despair, Anne suffered a false pregnancy and began experiencing frequent fits of rage. She understood she was no longer living up to the high hopes Henry had placed in her. The once charming and lively young woman had changed. Arguments between the couple became frequent. Anne was far from the submissive wife Henry had envisioned, and he grew weary of her quickly. In 1536, the once ignored and now dying Catherine of Aragon passed away and was buried with the honors due a Dowager Princess of Wales. Though Anne was pregnant again, her glory days were over. Henry had fallen in love with one of her ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Word soon reached Anne that the king's affections had turned to another woman. Henry had long ceased to hide his lack of interest in Anne. That same year, during a jousting tournament, he suffered a severe injury, his last tournament ever. He was unconscious for 2 hours, and many believed he had died. He sustained permanent damage to his leg and would never compete again. That marked the end of athletic Henry VIII. From then on, he stopped exercising, indulged heavily in food and drink, and began to resemble the Henry VIII known to history. Anne, in shock, miscarried the child she had been carrying. Enraged, Henry wanted nothing more to do with her. He believed the marriage was cursed, that Anne had bewitched him. He saw it all as divine punishment. He wanted her gone. So he tasked his uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, with removing Anne so that he could marry Jane Seymour. Like Anne before her, Jane did not give in easily. She pressured Henry to marry her and make her queen. Meanwhile, Norfolk and Cromwell executed their task with ruthless efficiency. Anne was accused of adultery with at least 5 courtiers, including her own brother, Lord Rochford. A court musician was tortured into confessing, corroborating the accusations. 3 days after her supposed lovers were condemned, Anne stood trial herself. She was also accused of plotting to kill the king. She accepted her fate with dignity. She knew those accusations were absurd, that she had been condemned long before the trial even began. Anne was imprisoned in the Tower of London and forced to witness the execution of the 5 men accused alongside her. The king summoned a French executioner, skilled with the sword, to carry out the queen's beheading. Days before her death, Anne was persuaded to sign a document accepting the annulment of her marriage and relinquishing any rights her daughter Elizabeth might have to the throne. In exchange, she was promised her life. Hoping for an act of mercy, Anne signed without hesitation. Yet she was executed on May 19, 1536. The king merely wanted to be free to begin anew, with his beloved Jane Seymour. Meanwhile, the English Reformation gained momentum, beginning with the dissolution of the monasteries. Parliament started abolishing religious institutions, transferring all their lands and wealth to the crown. These actions sparked uprisings. All seemed perfect between Henry and Jane until, on October 12, 1537, after a difficult labor lasting more than 3 days, possibly ending in a cesarean section, Jane gave birth to a healthy son. But just 2 weeks after Prince Edward's birth, Jane died. It is said that Henry was heartbroken by her death, and years later chose to be buried beside her. At that time, England was ravaged by plagues and smallpox, and Henry no longer felt secure, having only one male heir. He began to search for a new wife. However, due to his reputation, many candidates were wary of marrying him. A proposal was made to Princess Christina of Denmark, who famously replied, "If I had 2 heads, I'd put one at His Majesty's disposal." After dissolving the monasteries, Henry set his sights on dismantling other great institutions. These measures outraged foreign monarchs. Under pressure from abroad, Henry needed new Protestant allies and decided a German princess would be a strategic match. Thomas Cromwell suggested Anne, sister of the Duke of Cleves. To convince the king, the painter Hans Holbein was commissioned to create a portrait of the young woman. Henry was enchanted by Anne's image. She was 24, and fell in love with her portrait, confirming the engagement in December 1539. Unfortunately, the portrait had flattered her. In person, Anne looked very different, and Henry was disappointed. He felt deceived and humiliated. He told his courtiers, "I see nothing in this woman that resembles what was shown to me. Had I known earlier, she never would have entered my kingdom." It's said he referred to her as the Flanders mare. Still, they married. But according to Henry, they spent their wedding night playing cards to avoid intimacy. Anne of Cleves was deeply humiliated by the king, who made no effort to hide his disgust. He said, "She has neither the breasts nor the belly of a maiden. Being with her repels me to the point that I cannot touch her." Rejected and in a foreign land, Anne felt isolated and miserable, though she understood the marriage was a political alliance. The man behind this disastrous union was Thomas Cromwell, the king's most trusted minister until then. He had helped Henry divorce Catherine, break with Rome, and suppress the monasteries. Cromwell had reshaped the medieval system in favor of a more modern administration and had a reputation for ruthlessness. But he could not annul the marriage to Anne without damaging the alliance with the Duke. Like many brilliant men who crossed Henry's path, Cromwell was condemned and beheaded. Anne of Cleves, however, proved wise. She accepted the annulment without protest. Surprisingly, a strong friendship grew between them. Henry granted her lands, wealth, and the title King's Sister, making her the most respected woman in the realm after the Queen. By then, Henry had already set his sights on young Catherine Howard. She was the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, and like her cousin Anne Boleyn, served as lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves. Perhaps she reminded Henry of his lost youth, or represented everything Anne of Cleves was not. In July 1540, Henry married Catherine. He was completely captivated by her youth. But the marriage didn't go as he hoped. Their differences led to tensions. Catherine began an affair with another man, and though Henry initially refused to believe it, the betrayal was real. Enraged, he had her arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. She was executed, not with the sword, but with the axe, on February 13, 1542, charged with adultery and treason. Disillusioned and ailing, the king turned to foreign policy to distract himself from grief and humiliation. His armies defeated the Scots and their king, James V. The victory lifted Henry's spirits. He also secured a treaty with Charles I of Spain to form an alliance against France. This gave him the confidence to seek a sixth wife. This time, he turned to Catherine Parr, a wealthy 31-year-old widow. She was in love with Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour, but Henry, out of jealousy, sent Seymour away to the court in Brussels. In 1543, now old, sorrowful, and lonely, Henry became drawn to Catherine. She was everything his previous wife was not. Intelligent, a gifted conversationalist, fluent in Greek and Latin. The king found her a pleasant companion, a remarkable nurse, and a devoted stepmother to his children. Catherine helped reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. That same year, he passed the VIII Succession Act, reinstating them in the line of succession after Edward. In 1543, he married Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife. As his health deteriorated and death drew near, power struggles erupted at court. The leading contender was Edward Seymour, uncle of Prince Edward. Henry appointed him as a counselor to his son. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII breathed his last at St. James's Palace in London. Archbishop Cranmer stood by his side in his final moments. Perhaps he was the king's only friend and servant to remain until the end. The once indomitable monarch died at age 55, after nearly 38 years on the throne. Thus ended the reign of England's most controversial king. Yet he fulfilled his lifelong ambition of having a male heir. His son Edward, who would go down in history as Edward VI. Henry VIII is buried in St. George's Chapel beside his third wife, Jane Seymour.